Okay, please come to the front. I'm not nearly as intimidating as I look. Maybe. Welcome. Can you hear me all right? That's this is working. No, this sign says mouth must be 10 inches from the mic. You know, in my situation, that's kind of a challenge. But it's okay. We're working. All right. So welcome to what we expect to be the first of a series of biannual events sponsored by the Masters of Development Practice Program that will focus on major challenges facing the world and the global community as it looks at such things as poverty, inequality, environmental degradation, poor health, human rights abuses, and insecurity of every kind. My name is George Scharfenberger, and I'm very honored to be the program director for the Masters in Development Practice Program. The MDP is just over a year old. I have to say that this has been a long journey, though, to get to that point. It started more than 3 years ago when a team led by Professor David Zilberman approached or responded to a request for proposals from the MacArthur Foundation and was successful in our bid to get seed funding to start the program. Those of you who are involved with the university have to know that starting a new graduate program is far from trivial. But the importance of this challenge and the growing realization of the significance of globalization, as well as a desire by a generation, this new generation, to be connected to the globe in ways which I was not even able to imagine when I was their age, was what pushed it over the top and provided the impetus to get this going. In the succeeding months, thanks to university leadership, the leadership of the College of Natural Resources, a fantastic group of faculty, we were able to galvanize around a program that is multidisciplinary in its approach and hands-on in its orientation, one that defies the conventional wisdom of a university stovepiped. We created a cross-campus executive committee of faculty. We developed 8 new courses. We welcomed an initial cohort of 15 students representing 6 countries in addition to the US, and who have now nearly completed their second semester. So I'd like to ask the members of the executive committee, the faculty of the MDP, and the students who are here to please stand, as well as GSIs, please stand and be recognized. As I said before at the beginning, starting a new graduate program at the university, at any university, but particularly the University of California, is far from trivial. And even if the stars are aligned, none of this would have been possible without the devotion, the vision, the energy, the determination, and the political skills of one David Zilberman. We're very lucky to have him, and I'd like to invite him forward to introduce our guest.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for coming. We're really proud of our first cohort and the support that we receive across campus for the MDP. And now we are entering the second year, and we're really believing that we became more sustainable. I really want to thank all the faculty. Basically, the only thing I could give you are promises. And I hope that we are starting to deliver. And I really have to thank George and Eunice that we really stuck with the day-to-day activity of moving this program together. But I think that this program has been long overdue, and I really believe that it will grow and will really make a big difference in the way that we educate people in the area of agriculture, development, and the environment. Now, every year we decided to have 2 events And in this event, really to bring people that really represent and embody the values that we are really aspiring to. And I really don't think that someone embody what development practice and leadership is more than Prabhu Pingali. I think a lot of Prabhu has a distinguished career, and he moved from one place among several interesting and important places. And all the time, from time to time, people ask me, "How is Prabhu?" And I'll tell you what I tell him, what I tell them. Prabhu is really rare because he's an outstanding intellectual leader. From the moment that he moved from graduate school in North Carolina to Erie to CIMET, these are two centers of the CGIAR, to the World Bank, added the department in FAO, and then in Gates, he had something that was really unique. He had an incredible set of priorities, and he knew what is important and what is not. He knew that you really have to identify key points, define them, strive for them, make some basic discoveries, communicate them, and make a difference. And I think he was able to do it. When he was in the CGIAR centers where we have a lot of economists and not much has been produced, he was able to use economics to make the case that argues that altogether, sometimes we use too much pesticide. In many cases, we use too much pesticide, that we really need to introduce integrated pest management. And his research in this area, he led a research team that really introduced combined medical understanding with agricultural understanding to develop new models of pest control. In FAO, he took a unit that was a good unit and make it an excellent unit again, taking strong positions on issues of biodiversity, biotechnology, and biofuel. So when he moved to Gates, he really developed a path that emphasized science-based policy and developing new sources of data. So altogether, all this achievement justifiably led to papers that got awards, made him a foreign associate of the National Academy of Science and a fellow of the American Economic Association. Now, after being an outstanding practitioner, he will become a professor and join Cornell and produce a new generation of practitioners. So I am really proud to introduce you Prabhu Pingali.
Thank you, David. Very kind words. I should have come here earlier. Thank you all for coming this evening. It's a great pleasure to be in Berkeley today, and a great pleasure to talk to you. I'll be soon moving from the West Coast, so it's not going to be as easy for me to pop into University of California system as I have been doing from Seattle. David asked me to give this MDP lecture, and I thought for a while about what I should talk about. I thought I could talk to you about the Gates Foundation and what we do, but I decided that I'd like to use this opportunity to give a broader lecture about what's happening to agriculture development and what's happening to the enormous challenge that we have in terms of feeding our current population of 6 billion people and feeding a future population of 9 billion people. As most of you know, agriculture went through a very low period for several decades, starting in the mid-80s. Between the mid-80s to the mid-2000s, agriculture was a very undervalued sector. Funding for agriculture was at an all-time low. And there was a perception that we've solved the problem of food. And suddenly we got rudely awakened from that complacency towards the end of the 2000s, 2008, 2009 period, when world food prices shot up and agriculture came back on the agenda. And agriculture is strongly on the agenda today, with donor agencies such as the Gates Foundation, multilateral agencies such as the World Bank, but also national governments themselves. National governments in Africa, Asia, are beginning to take agriculture very, very seriously. But it's also true that there's an enormous sense of pessimism about our ability to feed ourselves and to feed ourselves sustainably. And my message to you this evening is that pessimism is unwarranted. I believe that as we look ahead, as we look towards 2050 and towards a population of 9 billion, we will be able to continue to feed ourselves sustainably and feed ourselves well. And what we need to do is prepare ourselves to get to that future. That's the message I'd like to leave with you today. But let me start by addressing the sense of pessimism, the sense of neo-Malthusianism that's present today. And there are many reasons to worry about the future of agriculture. We see unabated population growth rates. We anticipate that populations will increase by 50% between now and 2050. But it's not just the growth in populations, but populations that are becoming richer. Many of the populations that are currently living under $1 a day, under $2 a day, will be moving up beyond that benchmark. And as they go beyond that benchmark, they'll be demanding better quality food, more diverse food, and higher quantities of food. And that adds to the increased demand on the food side. FAO estimates that overall, as you look at 2050 time period, we need to be doubling the total amount of food relative to what we produce today. And that's going to be a major challenge. But that challenge is increased and is magnified by the fact that you have other diverse needs for the same food grains that we consume. Diverse needs in terms of the need for animal feed, to feed the growing demand for meat and livestock products, and also the demand for food grains that are used for biofuel production, for increased renewable energy sources. So these are the challenges that are leading to a sense of desperateness in a way, or a sense of urgency that surrounds much of the food policy discussion that's taking place today. And since about 2008, as food prices went up, that sense of urgency has increased enormously. When food prices went up in 2008, there was a sense at that time that this was a spurt, and you see food prices going back to their long-term trend, declining trend patterns. But we've not seen those food prices go down. We've seen food price spikes continue to take place. We've seen a spike in 2010. We saw another spike in 2012. And overall, food prices continue to be at a newer and a higher plateau today. And that's kept agriculture in the news, and that's kept agriculture in terms of overall domestic and international priorities, but it's also created a sense that this is a problem that we may not be able to solve. But the message I have for you is that we've been here before. We've been here in the 1960s, in the 1970s. In the 60s, there was a clear sense that Asia will not be able to feed itself. There was a clear sense in places like Berkeley, in places like Stanford, etc., that large populations in Asia would have to be triaged in order that the rest of the world can survive and can feed itself. And that sense of despondency was very clear in much of the writings that were taking place in the 60s and in the early 70s. The Club of Rome issued a report on limits to growth in which they talked about the fact that we were going to run out of resources by this time period, today. But we've not run out of resources. Asia has not starved to death. Asia has actually managed to feed itself and more. And some of the countries that in the 60s were thought of as desperate and starving, countries such as China, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, etc., are countries that are now seen as emerging economies. So there's been a dramatic change that's taken place in the food security equation in Asia. And as we look ahead, we need to look at the lessons that we learned from that experience and to see how we can apply that experience to the future and projected increases in populations towards 2050. What happened in the 60s? What happened in the 70s? What we saw was a massive increase in overall food productivity that took place. We saw that land-scarce economies in Asia saw a dramatic increase in food supplies. A dramatic increase in food supplies that came not by expanding the total area under cultivation, but rather by increasing yields on areas that were already under cultivation. We saw productivity growth, rates of growth in productivity surpassing rates of growth in population. So overall, per capita food supplies increased quite dramatically. And we saw this happening in Asia with the start of the Green Revolution that took place from 1967 onwards. We saw it happen in Latin America. And to an extent, a little bit later, you saw some of that productivity growth taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. Although in sub-Saharan Africa, overall productivity growth rates continue to be lower than the rate of growth in population. And Africa continues to be a major challenge today. But the lessons that came out of Asia were quite significant. The lessons that came out of Asia were investments in R&D is absolutely crucial to increasing agriculture productivity growth, especially smallholder agriculture productivity growth. Productivity growth of farms that are 1 hectare or less than 1 hectare, sometimes significantly less than 1 hectare. It's the growth of productivity in these areas that was spurred by new technologies that came out through the Green Revolution. Modern varieties of rice, modern varieties of wheat, corn, etc. But it was not just R&D that made a difference. It was R&D plus investments in infrastructure, investments in input markets, investments in output markets, and crucially, an enabling policy environment that provided incentives for farmers to invest in improving their productivity. Without that policy interventions, without that enabling policy environment, we would not have seen the dramatic changes that we saw that took place in Asia. So these are crucial lessons that we learned from the period of the late 60s, the 70s, through the 80s. And it's because all of these factors work together that we saw Asia moving from a continent that was desperate to a continent which was food secure. Doesn't mean that everybody had food to eat. Doesn't mean that you did not have hunger in many parts of the population in Asia, and you still do have it. But imagine a scenario where you did not have the productivity growth that took place in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Imagine what Asia would have looked like if you did not see that productivity growth. We still have a long way to go, but we've made an enormous start in productivity improvement. So looking ahead, as you think about 2050, we should ask ourselves the question, is the scenario of 2050 so very different from the scenario that we've come from in the 1960s and in the 1970s? And is it a scenario that we will not be able to achieve success? Are we so destined to failure as we look towards 2050? My answer, as you know, is absolutely not. I think there is an enormous potential for us to be successful in feeding a population of 9 billion. But as we think through the arguments, I'd like to look at both the demand side and the supply side of the projections towards 2050 time period. And let me start by saying, let's get the demand side right. A lot of the projections that are made on overall food demand towards 2050 are projections which in many ways depend on what we believe is the income elasticity of demand for food grains. What is happening as you look at emerging economies across the developing world is that over time, per capita consumption of food grains, especially rice and wheat, is declining as incomes grow. As incomes grow, you're beginning to see overall decline in per capita consumption of the basic staples. And the change that's taking place is an enormous diversity of diets. You begin to see populations spending less on rice and wheat and spending proportionately more on meat, milk, other livestock products, vegetables, fruit, etc. That's a fundamental change that's happening. Peter Timmer says that we are hardwired for this change in diet diversity, that as incomes rise, diversification of diets is a phenomenon that's given. And we see that happening across the developing world today. What that means from the supply side is a discussion that we need to have. But one needs to question the long-term projections that are made on the demand side to see whether they're getting that income elasticity of demand right or not. Also, as we look towards the diversification, one of the big changes we see is a fairly dramatic increase in livestock product consumption, meat consumption in particular. And you see this across the world as incomes rise and over time. And with that increase in meat consumption, in livestock product consumption, you do see a fairly significant rise in overall feed demand that's taking place. And much of the demand side around food grains, especially corn, you begin to see that as the demand for corn for food declines, that's being compensated for with the increased demand for feed. But you also see feed demand for sorghum, for millet, etc., that's taking place. And so there's some amount of substitution between food versus feed. But what we need to figure out is overall, what's the totals? And what's the total impact of the food and the feed as you look to the future? The second issue to remember as you look to the future is where the food is being supplied from. So if you think about much of the developing world today, much of the developing world in the 70s was a developing world which was a net exporter of commodities, food commodities, especially grains. But as you look to the end of the 2010 time period, you find that the developing world went from being a net exporter of food to becoming a net importer of food. And that becomes clearer as you take Brazil out. So where the food is coming from in much of the developing world is coming from OECD countries, from Brazil, from other Latin American countries, and in the future, potentially, from sub-Saharan Africa. And the imports that are coming into the developing world are not the traditional imports such as staple grains, but these are a diverse set of food products that are coming in. And these are temperate zone fruits, vegetables, dairy products, etc. But also, you're beginning to see an increasing share of the imports that are composed of processed products. Processed products that are coming from agribusiness companies in the US, agribusiness companies in Europe, etc. So as you think about future food supply, one can no longer think about future food supply as contained within a country, that all the demand is met through domestic production, but to look at the role that trade plays and look at the role of comparative advantages in production of the various commodities that are demanded in a diversified diet as you look into the future. And temperate zone products play a major role as you look at a diversified diet into the future. Then we come to the issue of biofuels. Biofuels is an area that's been of enormous concern. There are many people here in Berkeley that have been thinking about it. David Zilberman in particular has been working a lot on biofuels issues. There's a lot of concern about how much food grains will be withdrawn from human consumption for the purpose of biofuel production. Now, if you think about today, it is a concern. It's a concern in terms of food prices, the diversion of food that could be exported to Africa relative to food grains that are used for biofuel production, food grains that can be used for food aid programs relative to using them for energy purposes, etc. And it's a serious concern today. But think about the advances in biofuels that are taking place. Think about advances that are taking place in cellulosic technologies, the second, the third, the fourth generation biofuels. As you move to more cellulosic biofuel production systems, then the draw from the food grains into energy production becomes much smaller. And so it's not as much a drag on overall food supplies as one sees it today. And the extent to which food grains will be released from the biofuel system depends a lot on the advances that take place in the biofuel technology area, and the extent to which investments continue to be made in cellulosic technologies looking into the future, and the extent to which they will be profitable as you look into the future. So that's an issue that's worth thinking about as we look ahead. Now let me talk a little bit on the supply side of the story. So we do see an increased demand overall, an increased demand for food, an increased demand for feed, and to, at least in the short to medium term, an increased demand for food grains for biofuel production. The question that we now have is, do we have the capacity to meet that demand in the short, medium, and longer term? And one of the first questions that come up is, can we meet that demand without increasing overall land area that's cultivated? There is an obvious concern about expansion in land area and the consequences of expansion in land area. There's a lot of analysis around this, and a lot of the analysis shows that, yes, in fact, there's about 2.5 billion hectares of land that's suitable for cultivation that's available out there. But it's also clear that much of that land is not economical for cultivation for various reasons. It may not be geographically in a convenient location, doesn't have the infrastructure. It could have various constraints, physical, biological, socioeconomic constraints associated with opening up these lands. And most importantly, there are significant environmental consequences associated with large-scale opening up of uncultivated land and bringing much of the current land that's available into cultivation. There's biodiversity issues, there's carbon sequestration issues, and there's overall environmental issues around forest reserves, etc. So one would need to figure out a future in which the growth in overall food supplies would have to come through intensification of existing cultivated land rather than expanding into new areas for cultivation. Now, as you think about that, I think it's important to remember that much of the land that's cultivated today across the developing world is cultivated at levels of productivity which are significantly lower than they could be technically, and they could be economically if you had the right prices and if you had the right policy environment, etc. So there is no reason why an Indian farmer cannot get 8 to 10 tons of rice. There's no reason why an African farmer cannot get 6 to 8 tons of corn on their lands. Today, an Indian farmer gets about 3 tons of rice per hectare. An African farmer gets a ton of corn. There's huge potential today with existing technology to dramatically improve productivity on existing cultivated land across the developing world. And when you look at the best farmers and the average farmers in the same communities, you already see a significant yield gap that can be reduced. So that's an area that we need to see, how do you exploit that gap? How do you reduce the yields the productivity gap that exists today. And that's going to be the key to intensification of existing cultivated land and releasing non-cultivated land into non-agricultural uses. So the question is, can the physical constraints that exist today to improving productivity, can these constraints be overcome? I think one of the biggest issues as you think about enhancing overall productivity is soils, soil quality, land degradation, soil erosion issues, acidification issues, et cetera, et cetera. And quite often when you talk about African agriculture, people say African soils are so badly degraded that you can never increase their productivity. People say the same thing about soils in eastern India. People used to say the same thing about soils in Brazil just not too very long ago. But there's nothing inherently irreversible about low soil fertility. One needs to have investments in soil improvements that change the productivity levels of soils. And you see that with soil fertility management, with improved nutrient applications, whether the nutrients are chemical nutrient applications or organic sources of nutrient applications, you see significant improvements in overall productivity. Why do farmers in Africa apply so little fertilizer today? It's not because they don't know about fertilizer. It's because the returns to those applications continue to be low because of a very poor overall policy environment. When the policy environment makes it profitable for farmers to apply fertilizers, they do so. And that's where policy makes a big difference in terms of overall productivity change. Let's talk about Brazil. Less than 20 years ago, people were talking about the cerrados of Brazil as areas that were lands of low fertility, that could not be rehabilitated, that could not be a major source of agriculture productivity. Today, the cerrados of Brazil are the major source of agriculture exports from Brazil. How did the Brazilians do it? They did it by addressing the problem of soil acidity through application of lime. They addressed the problem of low organic matter content by bringing in conservation tillage, by incorporating crop residues, etc. They addressed the problem of low nitrogen through intercropping of legumes, and they addressed the problem of soil erosion through investments in irrigation, water harvesting issues, all kinds of erosion control techniques, and then bringing in drought-tolerant crops, grasses, etc. And massive investments that were made by Embrapa in rehabilitating the cerrados and converting them into the major agriculture resource that they are today. It was not accidental. It took enormous effort, but it was enormous effort with enormous payoff that took place. And as you think about Africa, and you think about much of the production system that's taking place in the savannas of Africa, the soils, the agroclimates in the savanna areas of Africa are very, very similar to the cerrados of Brazil. And the technology transfer, the know-how between these two regions is quite significant. And that's where I would see big changes taking place. Let's talk about water. Water is going to be a major constraint as we look to the future. Water is going to be a major constraint because of intersectoral competition that's taking place for water for various human uses, including agriculture, but also because of the way we are losing water, misusing water, and the degradation that's taking place to the water resources. If you think about it, if you look at overall withdrawal of water relative to consumption of water, there's a huge gap. There's a huge wastage taking place today. And just getting that wastage down leads to significant overall savings in water use. Now, it's not as if most people don't know that. But the fact that water is relatively free or free gives very little incentive for farmers to change the way they use water. It gives very little incentives for farmers to reduce the amount of water that they pump, or reduce the amount of water they use to flood their fields, etc. So there's a big economic policy challenge in changing the incentive structures for water use. If that incentive structure is changed, you will see a significant change in the way water is used and in improved efficiency of water use. The other area, as you look at overall food supply, is that more than half the production, overall food production, comes from rain-fed environments. Environments which depend almost completely on rainwater. And these environments are the areas which have the lowest productivity today. But there are various opportunities for significantly boosting productivity levels in these rain-fed environments. I think investments that are taking place today in terms of crops that are tolerant to drought, crops that are tolerant to flooding, high temperature, high salinity conditions, etc., can make a huge difference in overall productivity improvement for these rain-fed environments. At the same time, investments in rainwater harvesting, small-scale irrigation systems, improved water use efficiency, etc., can transform many of these rain-fed areas. Now, one thing that's important to remember about many of these rain-fed environments is when you travel through these rain-fed areas, people will tell you these areas are marginal. Yes, they're marginal for irrigated rice production or wheat production, but they may not be marginal for sorghum production. They may not be marginal for drought-tolerant maize production. They may not be marginal for small-scale vegetable production. So as you see these dire transformations taking place, what we call as rain-fed marginal environments may become the areas where you see much of the diversified production coming from. And the emphasis on rehabilitating and investing in productivity improvement in rain-fed areas is going to be a crucial part of the answer as we look ahead. And much of the work that's been done looking at rain-fed areas and investments in rain-fed areas show that the rates of return to these investments are very high, especially for smallholder agriculture systems. The last area I want to talk about is climate change. Climate change is going to be a major significant factor as we think about feeding a population of 9 billion. And it's a really important issue for us to worry about and for us to plan around. But as we do so, I think one of the first things we need to do is get a much better idea of the regional and local impacts of climate change, a much better idea than we have today. Most of the information we have on impacts of climate change is based on data that's not collected from experiments or trials which are done in particular geographies around particular farming systems, etc. There's a need for a much larger, broader-based assessments by very specific cropping systems, very specific farming systems of the impacts of climate change at a very local level and building up from that local level upwards. That needs to be done, but that doesn't take away from the fact that there is a major threat of climate change coming in. And how do we deal with that? I think the good news is smart agriculture is climate smart agriculture. A lot of what is being done today to address problems of stress, problems of drought, problems of flooding, problems of high temperature, etc., are technologies that have direct applicability as you think about farmers adapting to climate change. And I think that's a major benefit that you're seeing. The emphasis that's taking place on conservation tillage, low tillage systems, etc., has direct implications for adaptation to climate change. The emphasis placed on water use efficiency, reduced pumping, reduced use of diesel for pumping groundwater, etc., have direct implications in terms of adaptation to climate change. So a lot of what we are all promoting today in terms of smarter agriculture systems, more efficient agriculture systems, brings us in a way towards responding to some of the threats coming out from climate change. But in addition to that, one needs to think about longer-term investments in changes in overall cropping systems, bringing in crops such as sorghum, millet, etc., that are much more tuned in to high temperature, drought conditions, etc., and massive investments in R&D and infrastructure around tolerance to drought and tolerance to other stresses. So, as I come to an end of my talk today, let me say, as I think about 2050 time period, as I think about feeding a population of 9 billion people, I'm optimistic that we will get there. I'm optimistic that we will be able to sustainably feed that population, and we'll be able to gradually build up to that 9 billion number. But it requires us to maintain a constant and a very stubborn focus on agriculture, and a very stubborn focus on investments in smallholder productivity growth. It requires us to make massive investments in R&D for better technologies, and that includes investments in biotechnology. It requires us to look at an overall policy environment that's conducive to smallholders investing in productivity improvement. And that includes not just domestic policies, but includes trade policies also. It requires us to pay particular attention to stress-prone environments, rain-fed environments, and how to manage rain-fed environments. And it requires us to be smart about climate change and smart about investing in climate-smart agriculture. And it requires us to look at a biofuel strategy that weans away from the use of food grains for fuel and looks at alternate sources of feedstock for biofuels. I think we can do that. I think if we make all of those changes and if we keep those investments up, we will prove Malthus wrong once again. And we'll prove Malthus wrong because of our ingenuity and our ability to deal with resource scarcity through technical innovation and through focused policy change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes or so for questions. So if you'd raise your hand, I'd be happy to give you the microphone. This young man up here.
Should I introduce myself? Or yeah. Hi, I'm John Grams. I'm part of the Masters in Development Practice Program. Thank you so much for the lecture. And I kind of came to your last point. I was wondering, your policy recommendations are very focused on kind of what the global north can do for the global south. And I was wondering what might more be better to empower farmers on the local level to take on their own abilities. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in northeastern Thailand in a very poor part of that country. And when I would talk to the successful farmers in the area versus the lesser successful farmers, they really focused on business management and how they work their farm in a much more like profit, cost-benefit way. I was wondering if you had any other ideas that we could actually help empower local farmers as opposed to kind of doing this for local farmers.
Do you want me to take them as we go? So I think that's a really important question. And one of the things that donor agencies are learning, and many the hard way, is that sustainable solutions come when local communities say, this is what we want. And when we listen to local communities and design solutions around them, rather than coming in with a solution that we already have, which we want to give to a community. And that's been a continuing challenge. And there's a lot more interactions going on today. But what makes me really hopeful as I look to the future is when I travel in Eastern India or when I travel in Africa, the big difference that I see today relative to 20 years ago is the very strong community organization that you're seeing today. Women's organizations, women's producers groups, women's credit groups, women's dairy groups, etc., that have now organized themselves and then have been teaching themselves the management skills, the communication skills, etc. And they're the main interlocutors today when people come and say, what do you need? What can we do for you? And many of these groups are very articulate about what they need. They're also very articulate about saying they don't need something that you're bringing to them. So I think that's a big change that we're seeing today.
Thanks. You made reference to the fact of the Green Revolution in the mid-1960s, answered a lot of the great challenges at the time. And then we went into a 20-year hiatus where agriculture was de-emphasized. I think if you go back to the mid-60s, land-grant universities played a critical role in implementing some of the development practices that were going on. And then as agriculture became less important, land-grant universities played less of a significant role. So now when we're talking about the resurgence of agriculture, do you see a change in the role that land-grant universities could be playing or should be playing?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a big believer in the land-grant system, having got my PhD from land-grant university. But also, the land-grant model was transferred to India. Many of the state universities in India followed the exact land-grant model of the US. Same thing happened in the Philippines and several other countries. So the land-grant system has played an enormously useful role. But you know as well as anybody that in the 2 decades since the mid-80s, the land-grant system suffered significantly also in terms of the ability to provide support for international work. But you do see a big change there. And there's been a big change since about 2009, 2010 time period, where you see a lot more activity of the old land-grant system coming back to work in international development area. Places like the University of California system, Cornell, etc., which historically were very important, continue to do so. But the big change you're beginning to see is institutions that never had a history of agriculture becoming new players in this area. So you have Stanford and Columbia and places like that, which are now starting to have big agriculture development programs. And that's a big change. And that's something that's worth looking at as into the future and see what kind of different contributions come from these newer group of institutions. But if I can say one word on the land-grant system and the way the transfer of the system into the developing world, wasn't complete in a way. What happened in the case of India was the land-grant state universities got completely politicized. With the state governments, they had an elite capture at the state level, and saw a fairly significant depreciation of their overall capacity. And that's something that needs to be turned around as you look ahead and to see a renaissance in this area.
Appreciated your bringing in climate change, it's your last factor. But the time framing that you made isn't the real challenge for climate change. It's beyond 2050.
Yeah.
And, it looks like we reach, if you believe the models and the projections, particularly the upper end of those, which are not all that low probability, 10%, well exceed, what the world agricultural system could seem to withhold, to stand. We may even result in significant parts of the planet where you can't even work outdoors, let alone grow anything. How does that play out? So in a sense, the 2050 is a little bit of a trick because the climate doesn't really kick in, the climate change, until after that.
It's a fair question, but, once you get beyond 2050, it's really hard for me to imagine what the world looks like. So I had to cut myself to that level. But it's a valid point, and there's a lot we don't know about climate change looking ahead.
Hi. I was introduced to a program called the Purchase for Progress program by the World Food Program. It also emphasizes smallholders. So I guess I have 2 questions. One is, earlier we talked about research and development. Isn't it more difficult or more challenging to disseminate information gained from research and development to smallholders in the developing world? And why smallholders? Like, why should we place emphasis on them over other opportunities?
Why smallholders? That's, if you go to any part of rural Africa, or rural India, or rural Bangladesh, rural Central America, all of these areas, agriculture is produced by farmers who have 1 hectare, 2 hectares, less than a hectare of land. These are the majority population living in those areas. These are the poor. These are the people that grow food for their own livelihood. And if you want to bring these populations out of poverty, the surest way to do that is to enhance their overall agriculture productivity. That's the way you improve their food security, and that's the way you improve their capacity to produce more that goes into the market, that they can sell and earn income, etc. That's the way in which the Green Revolution strategy for productivity growth took place. So it was smallholders and improving the capacity of smallholders. So that's where I come out from. I totally, strongly believe that that's the path looking ahead. So, but what was your earlier question? I forgot that.
In terms of accessing them and encouraging them.
Right. So if you think about overall history of adoption, you find that where the market conditions were right, where the incentive systems were right, where the infrastructure was right, smallholders were very adept at adopting technologies, at increasing productivity. Where these conditions don't hold, smallholders are not going to adopt technologies that they don't need. If there's no incentive to increase productivity, smallholders are not going to increase productivity. If they know the returns to productivity increase is low, they're not going to adopt technologies for increasing productivity. So that's the key. And what the Purchase for Progress program does, it creates an assured source of demand for the increased production of these farmers. It provides them with the technical know-how, it provides them with the infrastructure, and then provides them the market outlet for selling their surplus. And that's the big strength of the Purchase for Progress program. And that's led to significant productivity growth in areas where Purchase for Progress has worked. Now the question is, what happens afterwards, and whether it's going to be sustainable over the long term, whether there's other private sector that will take over, etc. And these are things that one would have to see as we look ahead. But if the current trend towards local purchase of food aid continues, then the Purchase for Progress program would be a good model to boost local purchase of food aid.
There were 2 graphs that you put up, one showing the average caloric consumption going from 2000 in the 60s to 2800, which seems to lead to then a health issue, and especially because the next chart that you showed was an increased amount of processed foods being introduced into the diet. So how do we, this seems like an issue that didn't exist in the 60s and 70s, where how do we resist the urge to feed people with just the cheapest, most easily mass-produced food possible?
Good question. I think one of the lessons we should learn as we look ahead is that it's not just cheap calories as the diets diversify. And one needs to look at ways in which you promote a broader menu of food and incentives for doing so. In the Green Revolution period, the incentives was very much on more production of rice, wheat, and maize. But as you look to the future, you need a food policy that provides incentives for enhancing productivity without targeting particular commodities. And that's going to be a challenge. It's not an easy one to address, but definitely that's a challenge. And the obesity issues are related to some of that. But the obesity issues are also related to the cheapness of processed food and all of those sorts of issues. So that whole obesity discussion is a big discussion that needs to take place also. And there are other things that I've done where we tried to address that.
Since you worked at FAO previously and you've been in this field for a while, I'm wondering what, in your mind, is unique about the Gates Foundation approach to agricultural development in comparison to what everyone else is doing?
I had actually not mentioned Gates Foundation once in my talk, except it shows up here. But yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. There are other questions you may ask. I may say, well, I'm not going to answer that, but this one I will. The Gates Foundation is not an implementing agency. We don't go in and do projects. I was telling a group earlier, we actually don't do anything at the foundation. Our job is to help the work that others are doing. So today, we're a big donor to FAO for their statistics work, for their policy work. We're the second largest donor to the CGIAR system. And you may not believe it, we are also a big donor to the World Bank. So what we do is we try to see who the agencies are, who the partners are in the multilateral system, in the university system, in the national systems, in the NGO community, that are working towards addressing the needs of smallholder agriculture. And we support that work. The foundation, in an average year, gives around $450 to $500 million for agriculture development activities. And that's new money. It was not money that was there in 2008. So this is new money that's going towards our common cause of productivity improvement. So there's nothing that we are doing that's duplicating anybody's work. There's nothing we are doing that's replacing anybody's work. We are actually trying to help other people's work.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you for coming to speak with us today. That was very informative. And my question is basically, how do you prevent the new green revolution, which I know that your foundation supports, how do you prevent the revolution from increasing a middle class of farmer while marginalizing the poorest, which is, as many of us know, a well-known phenomenon of the first green revolution? There's a lot of talk about helping the smallholder farmer and especially emphasizing initiatives for promoting women's empowerment. But then you also see case studies in Tanzania, for example, where policies are designed to reach only the top 75% of the rural population while the lowest quarter is marginalized. And there are policies where, for example, the smallholder is defined as those who own 1 hectare or less of land. And that's the benchmark number by which policies are defined, and yet the average smallholder farm size is half an acre or hectare. I was wondering what your thoughts are about doing some R&D for maybe agroecological methods that utilize a resource that all farmers have, that is their labor, rather than trying to invest in inputs that may not be accessible to everyone.
So a lot of what we do is work on crops that are important for the very small farmers. So we don't work on cocoa or coffee or cashew. We spend all of our resources on food crops that smallholders first produce for themselves and consume in their own house and then sell the surplus. So a large share of our investment is actually going to crops for which there's very little investment by many other groups. Cassava, sorghum, millet, yams. These are crops for which there's very little R&D today. And these are crops that are grown by farmers with 1/4 of a hectare of land. That's what we do. I mean, there are lots of different models of agriculture development that different people have and different people promote and believe in, and we respect all of that completely. We are just one foundation who says we'd like to put our investments into better seeds, better livestock breeds, and better management practices that can fit into any system that there is. So, but we're not in this to say we are doing the best. We're just doing what we need to do and what we believe in. With that, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
On behalf of the MDP program, I want to thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you. Thank you, Prabhu.